On Christmas Eve, my stepfather shoved me away from his new $200,000 Aston Martin and said, "People like you do not belong near a $2 million car. Do not embarrass me." His hand hit my shoulder hard enough to make me lose balance, and my boots slid across the ice as I tried to keep the toddler in my arms from falling. I steadied the child first, then myself, but the burn of humiliation came fast and hot, even in the freezing air. Everyone standing in the driveway turned to look at me with the kind of silence that cuts deeper than shouting. The white lights wrapped around the railings seemed to spotlight me, as if the whole neighborhood was watching a scene I never signed up for. Rick stood tall in his red holiday sweater chest, puffed out as if pushing me made him the hero of the evening. I heard a few awkward laughs behind me, and the sound felt like glass cracking under my ribs. "You are just a tech girl living paycheck to paycheck," he said louder, so everyone could hear, "Stay in your lane." My mother Karen turned her face away, pretending she was too busy greeting guests to notice what just happened. I caught the flicker of embarrassment on her face. Embarrassment for him maybe, but certainly not for me. Logan, my 24-year-old stepbrother, barked out a laugh from the stairs and said, "She probably cannot even afford gas for this thing." He slapped the back of the man next to him as if he had made the joke of the year. I wanted to say something, but my voice refused to move. Not because I was scared, but because I knew words would only make them feel powerful, and I was done giving them power. I bent down to pick up the small gift that had slipped from my arm when Rick shoved me. As I did, my coat shifted and the metallic glint of a car key slid halfway out of my pocket. It caught the Christmas lights just right, giving a brief silver flash. Rick frowned at it for a second, then smirked, assuming it was some cheap knockoff from a rental. He had no idea what he was actually looking at. He had no idea who he had just tried to humiliate. If you are listening, tell me where you are tonight. Tell me what city, what state, what place you are sitting in while hearing this. It matters more than you think. And now let me tell you why that moment did not break me. It woke me up. My name is Mina Carter. I am 28 years old. I live in Boulder, Colorado. And until that night, I was the kind of woman who let people underestimate me because it was easier than confronting them. I wore simple clothes, kept my head down, worked long hours, and built a career quietly because quiet felt safer than being seen. What no one at that Christmas Eve gathering knew, including my own family, was that I had spent the past 7 years building an automotive tech startup that specialized in valuation algorithms and fraud detection systems used by major dealerships across the country. What no one knew was that 2 months earlier, a German automotive group had acquired my company for an 8-figure sum. What no one knew was that I owned 4 luxury vehicles in my name, all stored in a private garage in Louisville under a different LLC. And what absolutely no one even remotely suspected was that the key Rick saw slipping from my pocket belonged to a hypercar worth around $2 million. I kept these truths quiet because I wanted to live without the noise of people trying to take pieces of me. I wanted to breathe without expectations or hands reaching for what I built. But there is a difference between choosing silence and being pushed into it. There is a difference between staying quiet and being told you do not belong. In that moment, with the cold biting at my throat and the sting of humiliation still sitting heavy on my skin, I felt something in me shift. It was not anger, not yet. It was clarity. A razor-sharp understanding that this family had never seen me and never intended to. They liked me small, useful, invisible. They liked me staying exactly where they placed me, but I am not a woman built to stay where I am put. If they wanted to treat me like I did not belong in their world, then I would show them the world I had quietly built, while they were too busy mocking me to look up. And I would not raise my voice to do it. I would let the truth speak for itself. This is the night everything changed. This is the night I finally said enough. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. I want to know who is with me as this story begins. I grew up believing that quiet was safer than speaking, because in our small apartment in Fort Collins, silence was the only shield I had. The walls were thin. The winters were long and every sound carried through the hallway, like it wanted to expose you. My father left when I was 13, leaving behind a few boxes, a broken lamp, and a note that said he needed space, which was his way of saying he needed freedom. My mother, Karen, cried for 2 weeks straight, then met Rick 3 months later and married him before the year ended. I remember thinking the apartment felt even smaller after he arrived, as if his presence filled every corner with rules and sighs and judgments spoken and unspoken. He worked at a used car lot and liked to speak as if he ran the entire auto industry. He wore oversized belt buckles and cologne, so strong it made my eyes burn. Yet he had a way of convincing my mother that he was the best thing that ever happened to us. From the beginning, Rick treated me like an inconvenience, someone occupying a space he believed he deserved more. He walked into the kitchen one morning, took one look at my open textbook and said, "Smart girls become difficult women," as if intelligence was some sort of disease he wanted to stop before it spread. He said it casually while stirring his coffee. But the words stayed with me. The way cold air lingers even after you close the door. He wanted a house where he could be the smartest person in the room, and a teenage girl reading physics notes disrupted that fantasy. Logan, his son, was only 9 at the time, but Rick wasted no time teaching him the hierarchy he wanted. He would pat Logan on the shoulder and say things like, "Remember, son, we take care of the workers around here. We do not let them boss us around," while looking directly at me, so Logan could follow his lead. By the time Logan turned 12, he was already calling me a guest in my own home. I got my first job at 15 at a small bakery 2 blocks from school. I would leave the house before sunrise to sweep the floors and decorate pastries. And even though I handed every paycheck to my mother, Rick still told anyone who would listen that I lived off their generosity whenever I bought something small, like a notebook or a pair of earbuds. He would mutter, "Do not act like you are better than us," as if working hard was an offense against him. My mother never defended me. She would just say, "Do not get him started, Mina. He is under a lot of pressure," which sounded like an excuse she had practiced in front of the mirror. The injustice built slowly like layers of dust on furniture until one day you realize everything around you is coated in it. I kept my head down. I studied late into the night. I tried to stay out of Rick's way, but he always found a reason to remind me of my place. He criticized the way I walked, the way I spoke, the way I looked at him. Even he would say, "Wipe that expression off your face," as if my existence itself was offensive. When I was 16, my school nominated me for a STEM summer camp in Denver, a program for students who excelled in science and math, which felt like a lifeline. A tiny window opening into a world where I did not feel small. I filled out the forms, wrote the essay, packed my bag 2 weeks early, and checked the bus schedule 3 times. It was the first thing in years that made me excited, and maybe that excitement showed too much. Because the night before the camp, Rick knocked on my bedroom door and asked if I planned to leave the house without talking to him. I told him it was a school-sponsored program and that my teacher said it could open scholarship opportunities, and he smiled a smile that never reached his eyes and said, "We will see." The next morning, when I stepped outside, the car would not start. The dashboard was dead, the lights would not flicker. The engine silent. I opened the hood and stared at the empty space where the battery should have been. Rick leaned on the doorway, sipping his coffee with a look of satisfaction so sharp it could cut through steel, and said, "Your place is at home helping your mother, not pretending to be a genius." He spoke with a calmness that made the cruelty worse. I remember looking at my bus ticket in my hand and realizing I would not make it in time. My mother came out a few minutes later, wringing her hands, telling me not to overreact, telling me there would be other camps, but I knew there would not be. That was the moment it settled into my bones that no one was coming to save me. Not my mother, not a teacher, not a miracle. I would have to build my own escape brick by brick without letting them see what I was constructing. After that day, something changed in me. I started to observe Rick the same way I observed equations in class, looking for patterns and motivations and weak points. I kept my achievements quiet because the less he knew, the less he could sabotage. I studied on the bus, did homework in the bakery storeroom, stayed late in the school lab whenever I could. Fort Collins felt small, but my ambition felt larger than the living room arguments, larger than the insults, larger than Rick's voice when he told Logan that some people are meant to stay behind and keep the house running. I learned to survive by shrinking, but I learned to succeed by growing in the shadows, and although I did not know it, then every quiet step I took away from their control was the beginning of the life they would never see coming. The life that would one day expose exactly who they were and exactly who I had become. Christmas Eve in Aspen Hollow had always been Rick's favorite performance stage because the neighborhood was filled with homes decorated like holiday postcards, and he loved pretending he belonged among the wealthier families who lived there year-round. So when I arrived that evening, still shaken from what had happened in the driveway, I parked my old sedan exactly where Rick told me to put it 4 blocks down the hill near the dumpsters, because he claimed the neighbors should not see a cheap car near his house. The wind cut across my face and carried the scent of pine and chimney smoke as I walked up the hill carrying gifts in both hands, trying not to slip on the icy sidewalk. By the time I reached the porch, my fingers were numb, but Rick only glanced at the frost on my coat and said, "You should learn to be more presentable when you come to a nice place like this," as if I had chosen to hike through the cold for fun. Inside the house, lights glowed warm, but the warmth did not extend to me. Candles flickered on the mantel, cinnamon and rosemary filled the air. My mother hurried over, smoothing her holiday sweater and whispering, "Do not complain. It is his house. We do not want trouble tonight." She always used that phrase. We do not want trouble, even when the only trouble came from her unwillingness to stand up for her own daughter. I did not trust my voice to stay calm, so I just nodded and walked toward the kitchen where I heard pans clattering. The kitchen was crowded with noise and heat, and I saw Logan leaning on the counter, scrolling on his phone, while his wife tried to frost cookies when I stepped in, carrying the ingredients my mother told me to bring. Logan finally looked up and smirked in that familiar way that curled his lip before the insult came, and he said, "People like Mina are made for serving, not sitting. You could make yourself useful for once." I felt the words hit me, the same way the cold had hit me outside, sharp and sudden, but I forced myself to look past him at the oven timer, blinking red because reacting would only feed him. I set the groceries down and began chopping vegetables the way I had done so many holidays before, while they stood around talking about ski trips and crypto investments. The noise in the kitchen grew louder by the minute, and I felt myself shrinking into the routine that had been carved into me over years of being the helper, the extra. The afterthought I tried to focus on the rhythm of the knife on the cutting board, but every time Logan laughed, it scraped across my nerves. When dinner was finally ready, everyone rushed toward the dining room, leaving the kitchen in chaos, and I wiped my hands on a towel and followed them. But as I stepped into the doorway, Rick turned and blocked my way, with a stiff smile stretched across his face and said, "The main table is for the important people tonight, so you can sit in the laundry room. There is a small folding table there, and it is perfect for someone like you." For a moment, the sounds around me blurred into a muted echo. The clinking silverware, the chatter, the clatter of chairs, everything seemed far away and close. At the same time, I stared at him, wondering how he could say something like that with guests just a few feet away. But Rick thrived on the kind of cruelty he could disguise as organization. And my mother looked at me with that pleading expression that begged me not to escalate the situation, because appearances mattered to her more than dignity. So I swallowed the humiliation and forced a breath before stepping back toward the laundry room. The laundry room smelled like detergent and dust, and the folding table was barely big enough for one plate, but I sat down anyway, resting my hands on my lap to stop them from shaking. I could hear the laughter from the dining room spilling down the hallway, and each burst of joy felt like a reminder that I did not belong to them. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. Noah, the youngest child in the family, with his curly hair and wide eyes, toddled out of the dining room, holding a candy cane, and he came straight to me, because children recognize kindness. Instinctively, he climbed into my lap and whispered, "I want to sit with you, Aunt Mina." But before I could say anything, his mother appeared quickly, her voice tight as she pulled him away, saying, "You know the rules, sweetheart. You sit with the family at the big table, come now." The look on Noah's face, the confusion, the disappointment scraped something deep inside me, and I knew then that the cruelty did not stop at me. It trickled down, shaping the way even the youngest learned, who deserved kindness and who did not. As his mother carried him away, I heard Rick's voice booming from the dining room. "She will ruin our family picture if she stands anywhere near us," which sent a wave of laughter through the room, the kind of laughter that stung more than silence, because it meant everyone agreed or at least enjoyed the spectacle enough not to object. I sat there in the dim light staring at the cracks in the tile floor, fighting the familiar heaviness in my chest, the weight that came from years of being pushed aside, yet somehow the humiliation did not crush me the way it used to. Instead, it settled into something sharper, something steadier, a quiet resolve that spread through me like a slow-moving flame. I listened to the clinking glasses, the cheerful toasts, the muffled gossip while chewing slowly, trying to keep my breath even, because if I let my mind drift too far back to that 16-year-old girl who missed her camp and her chance at a different life, I knew I would break, but I was not that girl anymore. And the more they pushed me, the clearer that truth became. I did not belong at their table, but not because I was less than them. I did not belong because I was already walking toward a world they were too small to imagine, and their cruelty only made my steps surer, even as they tried to force me into corners meant to keep me quiet. 4 years before that Christmas in Aspen Hollow, when I still believed that keeping the peace in our family was more important than protecting myself, I learned a lesson that carved itself deep into my future, because it was the first time I understood how far Rick would go when he wanted control over me, and my mother chose not to see what was happening right in front of her. It started quietly, the way most manipulations do, with a letter I received in the mail, congratulating me on being approved for a new credit card, one I had never applied for, and at first I assumed it was a scam, but the envelope was addressed correctly and the bank name was real. So I called the customer service line, and after wading through the automated maze, I finally reached a representative who told me the application had been submitted online 2 weeks earlier, using my address, my social security number, and an income figure that was suspiciously close to the salary I had mentioned casually at dinner one night. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles hurt as I asked for the details, and she read them slowly, each one, hitting like a drop of ice water on my skin. And when she finished, she asked if I wanted to activate the card, and I said, "No, absolutely not, cancel everything right now," and she complied, then suggested I file a fraud report. My heart pounded as I walked into the living room where Rick was sitting in his recliner, watching golf highlights, and I held the letter out to him, asking if he knew anything about it, and he looked up with an expression so perfectly blank that for a second I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then he smirked just slightly and said, "You should be grateful. I helped you build credit. Mina, people your age do not understand how the world works. You need someone responsible to set you up for success." The way he emphasized responsible made me feel small and foolish, as if I should be thanking him for stealing my identity. And when I looked at my mother, hoping for support, she sighed and said, "He was just trying to help, honey. It is not a big deal." And that sentence burned worse than the fraud itself, because it told me exactly where her loyalty stood. I spent the next month trying to untangle the mess, paying off the charges he had made without telling me, because the bank said since it was opened with my information and no police report had been filed, the responsibility fell on me. $7,800 vanished into minimum payments, overtime shifts, and weekends spent debugging code for freelance clients. I kept every receipt, every email, every invoice, because I knew if I ever let myself forget how deeply they had betrayed me, I might forgive them. And forgiveness without change is just permission for them to do it again. I thought that nightmare was over until 2 months later, when I received another letter, this time addressed, with a company name I did not recognize, and the words, "Business loan denied," printed across the top, confused. I opened it and my stomach dropped as I read the details showing an attempted application for a $50,000 loan tied once again to my Social Security number. But this time, it listed a business registered to Rick's used car dealings. The bank had denied it due to insufficient documentation and questionable credit activity, which was the only reason I found out at all. My pulse thudded in my ears as I read further, seeing that he had claimed I was a financial guarantor and had attached an outdated pay stub that I vaguely remembered misplacing months before. I marched straight to the garage where he was rearranging tools and asked him calmly what this was about, and he shrugged like it was some minor misunderstanding, saying, "It is normal to co-sign loans for family. You are young. You should be happy to contribute to something that benefits all of us someday." And the audacity of that statement stunned me silent for a long moment, because he said it with such confidence, as if my labor, my identity, my financial future were all raw materials he could use whenever he needed to build the life he wanted. My mother entered halfway through the conversation, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and when I tried to explain what he had done, she cut me off saying, "You always make everything dramatic, Mina. He is just trying to grow his business, and you should not block opportunities out of selfishness, as if protecting my credit was an act of betrayal rather than survival." And in that moment, the air in the garage felt thick, choking the last bit of forgiveness I still carried. I walked back inside, feeling the old heaviness settle on my shoulders, but instead of sinking beneath it, I felt something inside me go very still and very clear. I realized if I did not protect myself, then no one would, and if I kept letting them cross lines, they would eventually erase me completely. So I went into my room, closed the door, and opened my laptop, creating a folder on my desktop labeled Simply Documents, because the less suspicious the name, the better. Inside, I began saving every email, every statement, every screenshot, every letter from the banks, every time-stamped note about what Rick had said or done. It became a ritual, almost like building an archive of truth that no one could twist or deny. I did not know exactly what I would use it for, but I knew one day it would matter, because people like Rick always believed no one would ever hold them accountable, and my mother's silence only fed that belief. Each night after work, I expanded the folder, adding digital copies of my IDs, my pay stubs, my tax forms, my passwords, all organized and backed up on an external drive. I kept hidden in a shoebox under my bed, because if Rick ever got access to my documents again, I knew he would push further than before, and I refused to let my future be collateral damage in his ambition. I watched them more closely after that, analyzing their behaviors, remembering all the times I had brushed aside small red flags because I wanted to believe our family was still salvageable. But the truth was clearer than ever. They saw me not as a person, but as a resource, something to borrow, use, drain, and discard when convenient. Those years taught me how to move in silence, how to think 20 steps ahead, how to protect everything I was building long before it existed on paper. And though they never noticed the shift in me, I felt it growing steadily, shaping me into someone they would never be able to control again. And even though I could not have known then how all these documents would become weapons one day, I sensed in my bones that the story was only beginning to turn, and the people who believed they had power over me would learn just how wrong they were. By the time the evening in Aspen Hollow drifted into its midpoint, the house had grown louder and warmer, and the air thickened with the kind of cheer that only works when no one looks too closely at the cracks beneath it. And Rick used that moment the way he always did, by stepping into the center of attention as if the room existed solely to admire him. He clapped his hands together, announcing that everyone should follow him outside, because he had something special to show off. The guests gathered their coats and wine glasses and drifted toward the driveway like obedient spectators at a parade, and I followed behind them quietly, keeping enough distance to pretend I was unseen, though I knew. Rick always noticed me when he wanted someone to belittle. The cold night hit us as soon as the door opened and the lights along the roofline cast a soft white glow on the fresh snow that had settled earlier. Rick walked toward the new car parked in the driveway, a glossy black machine he had talked about non-stop for weeks, and he touched the hood lovingly like it was a trophy he had earned, rather than an object financed through a questionable stack of loans no one in that circle knew about. The crowd murmured in admiration, and Rick puffed up like a man expanding to fit a suit he had no business wearing. He waved his hand proudly, saying, "This is what hard work gets you, folks. This is what success looks like." And the more he spoke, the more the crowd responded with impressed nods. I stood near the front of the group, arms crossed, trying to stay warm, watching the shallow pride on his face as he opened the driver door to show off the interior, and people leaned in, offering compliments that fed his ego like sugar. And for a moment, I felt something twist inside me, a mixture of disbelief and resignation that these people accepted his version of reality so easily because they only saw the surface and never questioned what lay underneath. I stepped forward to get a closer look, mostly out of curiosity, because although I rarely cared about Rick's possessions, I did care about understanding what he valued, since that always revealed how he would manipulate people next. When I reached out to touch the door, just lightly brushing my fingers along the polished metal, he jerked around as if I had committed a crime and snapped, "Do not scratch something you cannot afford." His voice cut through the cold in a sharp echo, and the guests turned toward me, as if waiting to see how the villain of his imaginary story would react. My cheeks warmed with embarrassment, but I held his stare, refusing to flinch, because I had learned the power of stillness in the face of cruelty. He wagged a finger as if correcting a child and said, "Step back, Mina. Some of us have worked too hard to risk someone else messing up our investment." The guests laughed politely, the way people do when they want to stay on the side of the person who seems to hold authority. And once again, I felt that familiar sensation of being pushed into the margins of a life I never fully belonged to. When everyone moved back inside, Rick immediately began handing out small orders, disguised as polite suggestions, and I somehow ended up carrying empty glasses to the kitchen, retrieving napkins from the pantry, fetching the gift bags from the hallway, and making myself useful, as he liked to phrase it. It felt like a loop I had lived through countless times, each order, a reminder of the role he assigned me, and every completed chore reinforcing his belief that I would always comply. The night became a cycle of him enjoying himself while I existed, on the outskirts functioning more like staff than family. Later in the evening, when the music softened and the wine flowed more freely, guests began drifting into groups near the fireplace, and the living room lit with warm, amber light, almost looked peaceful from a distance. I stepped in slowly, hoping to sit for a moment, because my legs ached from standing. For hours, I found a space near the corner where I could blend into the background. But before I could settle, Logan approached with a glass of red wine, swirling it lazily as he smirked at me. The same smirk he had worn since childhood when he wanted to prove he had inherited his father's cruelty. He leaned in, slightly pretending to look past me. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he tipped the glass just enough to send a splash of wine across the front of my shirt. The warmth of the liquid soaked through the fabric before I fully registered what had happened, and he stepped back, widening his eyes in fake surprise, saying, "Oops, that shirt looked cheap anyway." A few people nearby let out soft gasps, but no one stepped in. No one confronted him, and Logan grinned, satisfied with the scene he had created. I stood there staring down at the spreading stain, the deep red sinking into the fabric like a mark of humiliation. But instead of anger, I felt a strange calm wash over me, a cold, steady quiet that dulled the sting of shame. My mother rushed over holding a small cloth, and her first words were, "Not are you okay, but you should have dressed nicer." Honey people notice these things. She dabbed at the fabric gently, but her eyes stayed glued to the floor, as if looking at me directly would force her to confront something she did not want to see. I took the cloth from her with a small smile and whispered, "It is fine, Mom." And she nodded, relieved that I did not make a scene, but I knew the truth was not fine. And the more they pushed me, the more the truth inside me sharpened into something powerful, something patient, something inevitable. So I stood there, wine-soaked and quiet, smiling, just enough to confuse them, because the version of me they had shaped expected tears, or outrage, or retreat. But I gave them none of it. I gave them silence, a silence that promised I saw everything and forgot nothing, a silence that hinted at the storm they were too blind to anticipate. And as I turned away, walking back toward the kitchen, that smile stayed on my lips, soft, steady, deliberate, and for the first time I think they felt something shift, even if they could not name it. The night after the wine incident, I returned to my apartment in Boulder with the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and stays there. I turned on the heater and hung my stained shirt in the bathroom, hoping the smell of cheap detergent would drown out the memory of Logan's smirk. I wanted nothing more than to collapse into bed, but years of living under Rick's shadow had taught me that when something feels wrong, I should pay attention. So I opened my laptop and checked my email, the same ritual I did every night just to make sure nothing slipped past me. At first, everything looked normal until I noticed a thread. I did not remember starting one with the subject line, "Payroll Verification." The message had been forwarded from my inbox earlier that afternoon to an unfamiliar email address belonging to an auto loan department at a local dealership. My heart tightened as I clicked through the chain, seeing my most recent pay stub attached along with my full name, address, and employer details information I had never shared with anyone except HR and my accountant. I scrolled further and found a second forwarded email from the same day containing a PDF of my employment verification letter. The realization hit me slowly. Then all at once Rick had accessed my documents again, but this time he was attempting something larger than stealing a credit card. He was using my income to refinance one of his luxury vehicles. I sat frozen in the glow of my laptop screen, feeling both violated and unsurprised, because Rick had always treated my life as an extension of his convenience. He had a pattern of believing my accomplishments were resources for him to tap into whenever he wanted, and the fact that he had gone this far only confirmed that he never expected me to notice, let alone fight back. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly, trying not to let the anger swallow me whole, and instead force myself into the calm, quiet clarity I had been cultivating for years. I opened my cloud backups, checked permissions, and dug deeper into the email logs, confirming exactly when the documents had been accessed and forwarded, and everything pointed to the small window earlier that day when I had stepped outside to help with the groceries, leaving my phone unlocked on the counter. I knew what he was planning to do next, and it made my stomach twist. He wanted to use my income to lower his monthly payments on the car. He bragged about night after night, pretending he had earned the life he flaunted. I could almost hear his voice rehearsing excuses in case I ever confronted him, claiming it was harmless, claiming it was family, claiming I owed him everything because he had given me a roof when I was a teenager. The lies came to mind so easily because I had heard variations of them my entire life. I closed my laptop slowly and walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, but the glass trembled in my hand and I had to steady myself against the counter. The next day, I drove to work with a heaviness in my chest, replaying every moment of the night before, and trying to piece together how far Rick might have gone. Without my knowledge, during lunch, I stepped outside to breathe fresh air and remind myself that my life was separate from theirs, that the relentless grip they tried to maintain over me was slipping even if they had not realized it yet. When I returned home that evening, I found myself stopping at the door, listening quietly, as if expecting the past to reach through the walls, even though I knew they could not touch me here, not physically anyway. Weeks earlier, something had begun changing inside me, a kind of emotional freezing, not the numbness of giving up, but the stillness of someone who is saving energy to strike at the right moment. I felt it more intensely now as I sat at my desk, organizing my documents again, backing them up to 2 different encrypted drives and updating the timeline I had been building since the first fraud incident, years ago. Every detail mattered, every date, every quote, every financial inconsistency, because someday I knew I would need the full picture. A few days later, another puzzle piece fell into place. In the most unexpected way, I had stopped by their house to drop off a gift for my mother, something small and simple, because I still clung to the hope that one day she might see me clearly. And as I walked up the steps, I heard voices coming from the open garage. I froze before reaching the doorway, letting the shadows hide me as I listened. Logan's voice drifted out first, mocking and smug as always, saying, "She will never afford anything better. Dad, she is just a coder." The way he said coder made it sound like an insult, not a skilled career, as if being a woman in tech was somehow laughable in his world of small dreams and smaller accomplishments. Rick exhaled loudly, then said, "She will die in that old apartment. She does not have the guts to do anything bigger, and we can keep using her information until I get the rates I want. They will approve me eventually." His tone was confident, smug, sure of himself. And for a moment, my vision blurred with a mixture of fury and clarity. But then everything inside me hardened into ice, because hearing the truth spoken out loud by the people who claimed to be my family did not break me the way they expected. It simply confirmed what I had known for years. I stepped back quietly, letting their voices fade as I walked away, each word cementing the resolve growing in me. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the silence fill the car and wrap around me like armor. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not even feel the sting of betrayal anymore. Instead, I felt the cold, precise focus of someone who has finally stopped trying to win approval from people incapable of giving it. My silence became my first line of defense, and the longer I stayed quiet, the more they believed they were winning, unaware that every cruel word, every theft, every humiliation was becoming ammunition in the vault of truth I had been building for years, a vault that would one day open with a force they could never anticipate. When I returned to my apartment in Boulder that night, the city felt quieter than usual, as if the cold had pressed itself against every window, sealing the world into stillness. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and turned on the soft lamp in the corner, letting its warm amber light spill across the room, the way it always did whenever I needed to remember that this space belonged to me, and only me. I set my keys on the table, but my hands were shaking slightly from the echo of the conversation I had overheard hours earlier, and for a long moment I simply stood there, staring at the wall, unable to move, because my mind was running too fast and my body too slow. I finally walked toward the kitchen, gripping the counter to steady myself as I tried to breathe through the sudden wave of dizziness that came with the realization that everything I had sensed for years had been true, and perhaps even worse than I had imagined. It felt like reaching the bottom of a well where all the old memories of betrayal and minimization had gathered, waiting for me. And now they rose all at once, suffocating in their familiarity. My breath quickened in short, broken bursts, almost like someone was pressing their hand over my chest, and I pressed my palms against the edge of the counter, closing my eyes, trying to slow down the pounding in my head. My fingers felt cold, even though the heater hummed softly in the background, and I found myself whispering a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. Why do they hate me so much? Or maybe the better question was, why did I keep letting myself believe that one day they would stop? I leaned forward, resting my forehead against my hands as the truth settled into me, heavier than anything Rick had ever thrown my way. The truth that I had been underestimated, used, and taken from for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without bending. For the first time in many years, tears slipped from my eyes, but they were not the tears of a wounded child desperate for validation. They were the tears of someone finally waking up, someone who saw clearly that the pain was not proof of weakness, but evidence of how much strength I had been forced to grow in silence. I was not crying because they had hurt me. I was crying because Rick was so foolish that he had built his entire facade on lies that would eventually collapse the moment someone looked closely, and ironically, the person capable of exposing him was the same person he believed would always stay small and silent. I wiped my face with my sleeve, took a deep breath, and forced myself to move to my desk, opening my laptop with a steadiness that startled me, because an hour earlier I had felt like breaking. But now, something colder, more focused, had taken hold. Something that felt like stepping into the mouth of a tunnel where the darkness did not scare me because it contained the blueprint for my escape. I pulled up the automotive database login, the one I had access to because of my work, and entered my credentials, letting the system load its familiar interface. My hands stopped shaking the moment the dashboard appeared, and my breath slowed into something measured, something controlled, because here, in this quiet digital space, I had power, I had knowledge, and knowledge was the one thing Rick could never steal from me. I typed the VIN number of his new car, the one he flaunted as proof of his success, the one he guarded as if it were a crown jewel, and pressed search. The system processed the request for a few seconds, and then the results appeared line by line, and with every line that loaded my eyes widened before narrowing into a slow, deliberate smile as the truth unfolded across the screen. The vehicle had been in a major accident 3 years earlier, the entire front end rebuilt, the paint repaired twice. The mileage rolled back during a resale attempt flagged by the system as suspicious. The current listed value was far below what Rick had bragged about at dinner, not even close to the luxury price tag he claimed. And then, the final red markers appeared. Illegal financing, flagged unverified income report, suspicious loan pattern pending compliance audit. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling the cold clarity settle deeper into my bones. Rick had been parading a financial time bomb through the neighborhood, convinced it made him a king, while completely unaware it was a fuse waiting for the right spark. And as the database highlighted each irregularity, I realized I was holding the match. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the discovery ground me. Because this was not petty revenge. This was truth, and truth did not need to be loud or dramatic. It simply needed to be revealed at the right moment. My hands no longer shook as I saved copies of the vehicle report, the loan flags, the maintenance discrepancies, and the resale alerts into the encrypted folder I had created years ago. And as I organized each file, I felt the last remnants of doubt dissolve, because there was no turning back now. I was no longer the girl begging for a seat at their table. I was the woman staring at the blueprint of their downfall and understanding exactly where each crack would spread once touched. I closed my laptop gently, stood up, and walked toward the window, pulling back the curtain to look out at the quiet street below. Where snow gathered on the sidewalks, glowing faintly under the streetlights, the world outside looked peaceful, still untouched by the storm forming inside me, and for the first time in my life I did not feel small or cornered. I felt dangerous in the calmest way possible, because I finally understood the truth. Darkness is not always the place where you break. Sometimes it is where you become someone they never saw coming. And as I watched the snow fall, I whispered to myself, not in fear, but in certainty. Rick has no idea what he just started. I barely slept that night. The quiet in my apartment felt charged, as if every shadow carried the weight of what I now knew, and when dawn finally crept through the blinds, I was already dressed, pacing slowly across the living room because the decision had already formed inside me, like a blade cooling into shape. And there was no world in which I would let Rick continue using my mother's name, manipulating my income, and parading around with a car that should have been reported months ago if anyone at the bank had been awake enough to notice the truth that sat in my laptop. I grabbed my coat, stepped outside, and drove toward Louisville, letting the winter morning wrap itself around me while my mind sharpened with every mile And as the landscape shifted from suburban Boulder to the more industrial edges of Louisville, my heart began to steady, because I knew what I was about to do was no longer about anger, but about reclaiming ground I had given away since I was a teenager. I pulled into the inconspicuous warehouse row where my private garage sat tucked between a machine shop and a storage facility. Nothing special from the outside. No one would ever imagine what waited behind the steel door, and that was exactly why it worked. Every time I came here, I felt like I was stepping into the only space in my life untouched by judgment, untouched by manipulation, untouched by Rick's need to feel superior. I keyed in the access code. The metal door rolled upward, and the warm lights flickered on, revealing what Rick always believed I could never afford. The truth of my life lined up in polished rows: a black Mercedes AMG GT, a pearl white Porsche Taycan, a deep navy Range Rover, autobiography, and the one that always made me pause, a Pagani Huayra, painted in a rare silver-blue finish, gleaming under the overhead lights like a secret. Only I was allowed to touch. I stepped inside, breathing in the faint scent of leather and machine oil, the kind of scent that never existed in the cramped Fort Collins apartment of my childhood. And for a moment, I stood there whispering to myself that none of this was given to me, that every inch was earned through long nights, writing code, debugging systems, building prototypes, and refusing to let anyone define what I deserved. I walked to the work table, opened my laptop, and let the glow pull me back into focus. The same reports I had pulled last night loaded onto the screen, and I began compiling them into structured documents, because this time, the information would not just be for me, it would become the cornerstone of the collapse that Rick had carved out for himself when he tried to stand on my shoulders and pretend he was taller. I drafted the fraud report, meticulously attaching the flagged VIN records, the inconsistent financing, the undervaluation reports, the auction history, and the inspection failures, each piece forming a puzzle that no bank would ignore once it landed in the right inbox. I moved next to the complaint about unlicensed dealership activity. This one made my pulse sharpen because Rick had always talked about his glory days selling cars, as if that world still owed him a throne. But the truth was, he had been skating on the edge of legality for years, flipping cars without the proper licenses, registering them at questionable addresses, using loopholes like stepping stones. And now I had more than enough documentation to expose every single shortcut he had taken. Then I prepared the formal notice for the auto lender, summarizing the discrepancies between the reported income and the real financial records, adding proof of the forged documents that I strongly suspected Rick had nudged my mother into signing without explaining the risks. And as I typed, my chest tightened, because the betrayal that hurt the most was not what he had done to me, but what he had done to her. My mother, who had lived so long under his influence, she no longer recognized the difference between loyalty and survival. As I gathered each file into a final folder, I felt an odd mix of sorrow and resolve twisting together inside me like threads binding into rope. And I clicked through my encrypted archive to double-check every piece of evidence when I opened a scanned PDF I had not touched before and saw my mother's signature slanted shaky at the bottom of a loan agreement for $60,000 secured against her identity. The air left my lungs in a hard, quiet gasp. I stared at her name, the loops uneven, the ink faint, and I knew instantly she had not signed that. With understanding, she had signed it because Rick had placed it in front of her with that familiar tone, the one that always sounded like a favor owed rather than a choice. And I pressed my fingers to my mouth, fighting the sting of fury rising in me, because this was not just financial abuse, it was a theft of trust. I scrolled through the pages and saw Rick's name listed as the co-signer, but the primary responsibility sat on my mother's shoulders, and the payment plan had already fallen behind, which meant that soon the bank would start calling her, and Rick would do what he always did, pretend. Shock act offended, blame someone else, maybe even blame me for not helping sooner. I sat back in the chair, the laptop screen washing my face in blue light, and for a long moment all I could do was breathe slowly in through my nose, out through my mouth, telling myself not to break. Because this was the moment I had spent years unconsciously moving toward, the moment when my silence would finally turn into something sharp enough to cut through the rot. A calmness settled over me, the kind that feels like the eye of a storm, not because the chaos has ended, but because the storm is finally under my control. And I whispered a single sentence that felt heavier than all the years Rick had tried to make me small no more. I gathered every report, every screenshot, every signature, every inconsistency, and packaged them in separate folders addressed to the state licensing board, to the bank's fraud department, to the Consumer Finance Bureau, to the lender compliance team, and to a lawyer whose card had been sitting in my drawer for months, waiting for a moment I never wanted, but now absolutely needed. I saved everything to an encrypted drive, placed it in my coat pocket, then turned back to look at the Pagani, its paint shimmering under the lights, and I understood with absolute clarity that the life Rick believed I did not belong in was a life he could never reach, not because of money, but because of character. I walked toward the door, shut off the lights, stepping back into the cold Louisville morning, and as the metal door slid shut behind me, I knew the most important part of revenge had already happened. The revenge was not the reports or the exposure. It was the moment I finally said no, and meant it with every part of myself. I drove back to Boulder with the folders still warm in my coat pocket, and for the first time in years the steering wheel felt steady beneath my hands, as if my body finally understood that I was no longer running from anything. And when I reached my apartment, the sun was already slipping behind the mountains, leaving the sky bruised with purples and muted gold. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and placed the encrypted drive on the counter, knowing that by morning everything I had set in motion would begin unraveling the life Rick had built on borrowed pride and other people's names. I spent the evening quietly moving around the apartment, making tea, opening the window, letting the cold air sweep through because I needed the silence, the clean kind, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks open and takes shape. The next morning I woke to a soft thud at my door, and for a moment I thought it might be a package or a neighbor. But when I picked up the envelope, the bank logo stared back at me, and I felt the air tighten inside the hallway, because I knew this was the first domino. I went inside, tore the top carefully, and read the letter that spelled out the words "Suspicious Activity Review" on the loan connected to Rick's vehicle, and another account linked to my mother's name, and it explained that the financing department required an in-person meeting within 72 hours. Failing to appear could result in immediate suspension or termination of the loan agreement. The words felt like an echo of everything I had sent the night before, precise, cold, undeniable. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing code at my desk, and when I answered, all I heard was my mother's voice trembling under forced calm. She said, "Your stepfather got a notice from the bank. Something about irregularities. They want him to come in. He is furious. He thinks someone is sabotaging him." And I could picture Rick pacing in their living room, trying to decipher how years of cutting corners had suddenly caught up to him. I listened quietly, not offering explanations or apologies, and when she exhaled shakily, asking, "Do you know anything about this?" the only words that left my mouth were, "I said no more," because that was the promise I had made to myself, and now it was unfolding exactly as it needed to. By the third day, everything accelerated. Rick's credit score dropped so sharply it triggered automatic alerts, and he started receiving calls from lenders who wanted explanations for inconsistencies in his paperwork. The same paperwork he had signed with that careless confidence he used whenever he believed no one would question him. Then the dealership called him demanding he return to review the loan contract because there were flagged discrepancies between the stated income and the verified records, and knowing Rick, he probably marched in there with that defensive swagger, ready to blame the system or a clerical error. But this time, the numbers were too clear, and the inconsistencies too specific. And when the dealership told him the financing might be suspended pending investigation, I imagined the redness rising in his face, the sputtering disbelief, the shock of losing the illusion he valued more than the car itself. That evening, the chaos finally breached my quiet apartment when my phone rang at nearly 11:30 at night, and when I saw my mother's name on the screen, I let the call ring once before answering because I already knew what her voice would sound like. And when she finally spoke, she was whispering as if Rick were pacing nearby. She said, "Mina, your stepfather is panicking. He cannot sleep. He keeps calling people asking for help, and he says someone is trying to ruin him. Tell me, please, did you do something because he is scared?" And when I heard the quiver in her voice, I closed my eyes, letting the cold calm settle over me again before saying slowly, "I told him no more." She inhaled sharply, as if she did not know how to interpret the sentence, or maybe she finally understood that the daughter she had spent years defending in half-hearted ways had grown into a woman who no longer asked for permission to protect herself. She tried to speak again, her words breaking apart, but I told her I needed to sleep and ended the call before she could find a way to talk me out of a decision she never helped me avoid in the first place. Over the next 2 days, the fallout expanded like a crack through glass. The dealership demanded documentation from Rick, and when he failed to provide it, they suspended the loan temporarily, leaving him without the security he bragged about. Every time he flashed his keys at the dinner table, the bank flagged a second loan under review, the one tied to my mother's signature, and they contacted her with questions she could not answer, confirming my suspicion that she had signed without fully understanding the agreement, and the guilt that flickered briefly in my chest hardened into something else, something protective, something that said I would rather destroy every lie he built than watch him drag her deeper into debt she did not choose. Rick began calling me by the evening first, once, then twice, then 6 missed calls in a row, and when I did not answer, he sent a series of frantic messages filled with accusations and demands, mixed with pleas that did not sound like him. And it was almost surreal reading them, because this was the man who once told me to stay in my place, now begging me to help him, keep the very life he said I never belonged near. I ignored every message and turned off the ringer, letting the room sink into stillness because silence had always been his weapon, and now it finally belonged to me. On the third night around midnight, the phone rang again, and I let it play out until the voicemail clicked in. And when I listened later, I heard my mother's voice instead of his soft, tired, and stretched thin. She said, "Mina, he is falling apart. He thinks someone is trying to ruin him. I do not know what to do. Please talk to him or tell me what is happening. I cannot take this tension in the house." And for a moment, I almost felt the old instinct, the one that pushed me to fix things that were never mine to fix. But I pressed my thumb against the screen and whispered to myself that this time the consequences were his to carry, not mine. I sent her a single text before turning off the phone for the night. It said only one sentence, "Mom. The truth is catching up to him. Let it." And then I placed the phone face down on the table, sat in the quiet glow of my living room, and let the reality settle that this was only the beginning. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the air in Longmont had that sharp winter bite that made every breath feel cleaner, colder, more honest. And as I drove toward my Aunt Marlene's house, I could already picture the warm lights strung across her porch, the crowd of relatives gathering inside with their usual noise and assumptions. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I knew Rick would be standing tall, pretending nothing in his life was unraveling, even though the truth had already begun chewing through the foundations he worshipped. I was not going there to argue or defend myself. I was going because sometimes justice needed witnesses, and tonight every witness would be present without realizing they were about to watch the curtain fall. I parked a few blocks away, letting the engine hum in silence as I waited, because timing mattered something. Inside me said to hold still, to let the night arrange itself, and I trusted that instinct, The same instinct that had been ignored for years, pushed down under other people's expectations, now rising like a tide, shaping the moment that would change everything I saw: cars arriving, families stepping out, laughing, carrying dishes and gifts, and slowly more and more people gathered inside the warm glow of the house until I could hear faint music through the crisp air. And I imagined Rick at the center of that room, puffed up trying to reclaim dominance. After a week of phone calls, warnings, and financial tremors, he did not understand how to stop. And right on cue, my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin inside a picture of Rick raising a glass. The caption, "He is bragging about the car again," says people are jealous. I stared at the screen, feeling a quiet, steady breath move through me because he had no idea how close the storm was. 10 minutes later, I saw a pair of bright white headlights turning onto the street, but higher, wider, slower. And when the truck came into full view, I recognized it instantly. A tow truck, heavy duty, rolling toward my aunt's house, with the deliberate calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times and did not care, who watched my heart did not jump. It settled, as if everything falling into place was simply the next chapter of a book already written, and the driver stopped right in front of the driveway, stepping out with a clipboard and a reflective jacket, while the cold air seemed to sharpen around him. I stayed in my car watching as the door to the house opened, a slice of golden light spilling out, and several relatives peered out, murmuring and stepping aside as Rick walked proudly toward the tow truck, probably believing they were there to deliver something special for him, the irony making the moment almost surreal. I could see his expression shift from confidence to confusion, then to full-blown denial as the driver explained calmly that the vehicle registered under his name was being repossessed under order of the lender due to fraudulent inconsistencies and unpaid account verification requirements. Rick's voice carried across the entire street, sharp, loud, desperate, as he shouted something about mistakes, threats, conspiracies. And within seconds a crowd gathered around him, relatives, neighbors, strangers, everyone pulled by the sheer gravity of public humiliation unfolding in real time. Phones were already out recording as the tow truck backed up, its lights flashing across the snow, lighting up Rick's reddened face as he tried to block the driver from hooking the wheels, screaming that this was a misunderstanding, that someone was sabotaging him, that he would call his lawyer, that none of this was real. But his voice broke every few seconds, betraying the fear underneath the bravado. And the more he shouted, the more ridiculous he looked, until even the neighbors who used to admire his theatrics stared with pity or amusement. Then he did exactly what I expected. He pulled out his phone, hit record, and went live on TikTok, ranting about injustice, pointing at the truck, accusing the bank, calling out imaginary enemies, all while thousands of people watch someone who had always thought he was untouchable crumble under the weight of documented truth. And that was the moment I stepped out of my car, slowly, intentionally, letting the night settle around me as I walked down the sidewalk toward the house, the cold biting my cheeks and the quiet hum of my engine fading behind me. And with each step, I felt lighter, freer, as if years of being minimized were peeling away with every footfall I turned the corner, just as the tow truck began lifting the front of the car, and the entire crowd turned at the sound of the deep, low rumble rising behind me, a sound that did not belong to anything ordinary, a sound people recognized even if they had never seen the machine that created it, because the unmistakable growl of a Pagani Huayra cuts through air like a blade. Conversations stopped, bodies froze, heads snapped toward the street as the silver-blue hypercar eased into view, its lights gliding across the snow like a phantom, its engine idling with the confidence of something that did not need to prove itself, because the proof was in its existence. I drove slowly into the driveway, letting the headlights wash over the chaotic scene, Rick standing in front of his car, which was now half lifted by the tow truck, while dozens of phones recorded both spectacles at once. And when I turned off the engine, the silence that followed was not really silence. It was stunned breath, held in a single suspended moment. I opened the door, stepped out and closed it gently, the sound echoing through the stillness, and no one moved. Not Rick, not my mother, not Logan, not a single relative, because every person there understood instantly that the girl they had mocked, pitied, dismissed, did not live the life they imagined she lived. And Rick stared at me as if seeing me for the first time in his life, his mouth opening then closing as if trying to assemble a version of reality that did not include the car behind me. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a simple envelope, white, unassuming, nothing like the scene it was about to detonate, and walked straight toward Rick, who was trembling now from anger, embarrassment, fear, or all of them tangled together. I held the envelope out to him, and he refused to take it, his hands shaking too much, so I placed it into his jacket pocket with quiet precision, then took one small step back so the entire crowd could see both of us clearly, and with a calm voice that carried farther than a shout ever could, I said the words that had waited years to be spoken. You said I did not belong in a luxury car. Turns out you did not belong in the truth. Gasps moved through the crowd, the kind that ripple like wind through trees, and Rick staggered back, looking around helplessly because there was nothing he could say, no lie he could reach, for no version of the story he could twist to paint himself as the victim. Not when his car was hanging in the air behind him, not when the hypercar I arrived in gleamed like a quiet verdict, not when every phone was still recording. I did not stay to watch him open the envelope, not yet. Inside was the full documented history of his car, the fraud, the loan violations, the rebuilt accident record, and one sentence clipped to the top, saying, "This is the truth you tried to hide." I simply turned, walked back to the Pagani, opened the door and sat inside, letting the engine hum back to life as I pulled away, leaving behind the noise, the shock, the unraveling, and the moment that finally made everything visible to everyone who had spent years pretending not to see. 3 days after the New Year disaster, the videos of Rick screaming at the tow truck had already spread far beyond our family group chats, drifting into neighborhood forums and even local community pages in a way he could not control. And as the humiliation followed him like a shadow, it did not take long for the damage to ripple through his life, because the dealership where he worked called him in for an emergency meeting, and within an hour he walked out, unemployed, his badge deactivated, his access revoked, his voice hoarse from arguing with people who were no longer willing to risk their business on someone whose reputation was unraveling in public. I heard everything through a combination of whispered messages from relatives and the long, frustrated voicemail he left on my phone, a jumble of anger and desperation clinging to each other until neither one could stand straight. And though I did not respond, I listened once, letting his frantic breathing wash over me without raising even a flicker of sympathy. By the end of the week, the lenders had frozen the disputed auto loan, and 2 other accounts tied to my mother's name were placed under compliance review, which meant the bank now controlled the funds until the investigation was complete, leaving Rick with no liquidity and no way to pretend everything was fine. I imagined him pacing their living room, the smug confidence he once wrapped around himself like a coat now peeled away, revealing what everyone refused to acknowledge for years, that beneath the swagger, he was nothing more than a man who depended on other people to prop up the image he projected. My mother called me twice in a single morning, her voice thin from stress, saying, "Your stepfather is not handling this well. He cannot sleep. He keeps asking why this is happening," and I replied gently that the truth always arrives, eventually, even when people spend their whole lives running from it, and she fell silent not because she agreed, but because she finally understood she could not talk me out of the path I was on. 2 days later, around 6 in the evening, my doorbell rang at my new house in Golden, a quiet, modern place with wide windows that overlooked the foothills and filled the living room with pale winter light. And when I opened the door, Rick was standing there for the first time in my life, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, His coat unbuttoned his face raw with exhaustion, as if the week had drained him of every ounce of his practiced bravado. He stared at me for a long moment before trying to smile, but the smile cracked halfway into something desperate, and he said, "Mina, I need to talk to you. Just 5 minutes, please." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me because he had no right to see the life I built, the life he insisted I was too small to reach, and the cold air curled around us as he ran a trembling hand over his face, saying everything is collapsing. The bank froze our accounts, the dealership fired me, and they say the car might be taken permanently. I do not know what to do. You understand numbers? You know this stuff. Help me refinance, help me fix this. He said the words "help me" as if I had not spent my entire childhood being told to stay in my place, as if he had not shoved me on the ice on Christmas Eve, as if he had not mocked me in front of relatives for years, reducing every accomplishment into something inconvenient, something less worthy than his imagined successes. And I looked at him standing on my porch, begging for the very skills he once belittled, and felt a calmness settle over me, a clean, sharp line inside my chest, drawing itself without hesitation. I said, "You taught me I did not belong in your world. You made sure I felt it every chance you got, and now you do not belong in mine." And the way his eyes widened told me he finally understood that the door I was closing was not just the one behind me, it was the one he had slammed on me for more than a decade without thinking I might one day walk away for good. He stammered something about family, about mistakes, about needing a second chance, but his words slid off me like water over stone, because I had listened to him tear me down for so long that there was no gravity left in anything he said. And when he reached out, as if to grab my arm to pull me into his crisis, I stepped back enough that the gesture collapsed in the cold air between us, leaving him shaking from anger or fear, or the realization that I was no longer the girl he could bully into compliance. I told him to leave before I called someone to escort him off my property, and he stared at me stunned before turning and walking down the driveway. His steps uneven, his breath fogging in the fading light, and as he reached the street, he looked back once expecting maybe pity or invitation, but I simply opened my door and walked inside without another word. The next morning when I checked my email, there was a message request from Logan, the same man who had laughed at me in Aspen Hollow, the same man who whispered cruel jokes about me into other people's ears, thinking I would never hear them. And now he wrote a trembling paragraph saying he admired my career. He had always known I was talented. He wondered if I could help him get into tech, maybe refer him to a company or give him guidance on where to start, because he wanted stability, and maybe I could help since I was doing well. I stared at his message, feeling nothing but a quiet disbelief at the audacity, because he had spent years treating me like a punchline, and now he wanted to stand on ground. He mocked me for building. I blocked him, without replying. The click of the button, almost too easy, considering the weight of the history attached to it. But that was the odd gift of clarity. Once you stop shrinking yourself, other people's demands lose their power instantly. For the rest of the day, I kept my phone face down on the counter, letting the silence of my home fill the spaces where guilt used to live. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long amber shadows across the floor, I realized that the return of those who once tried to break me was not a burden. It was proof that I had finally risen so far above them that the only direction they could reach for was upward, even though I would never again be the hand they used to pull themselves out of the consequences they created. When winter and golden finally softened into that quiet, pale light that settles over the foothills, like a blanket, the kind that makes every morning feel like a new beginning, I found myself waking up in my small cabin, tucked against the edge of the ridge, where the world felt calm in a way I had never known growing up, and I would step outside onto the wooden porch, still holding the first mug of coffee of the day, letting the steam rise into the cold air, while the snow drifted gently from the branches around me. And for the first time in my life, I felt no weight pressing down on my chest, no voice telling me to shrink, no reminder that I did not belong because the space around me belonged entirely to me, and the silence that once felt suffocating now felt like a gift I had given myself after years of living in other people's storms. I had chosen Golden not because it was flashy or loud, but because it held a kind of quiet strength that resonated with the part of me that had survived everything Rick tried to break. And most mornings I would sit on the porch, letting the cold air sting my cheeks as I watched the horizon brighten a little more each minute, telling myself that peace was not something that arrived on its own. It was something you earned, one hard boundary at a time, one brave decision after another. A month after the New Year fiasco, I started volunteering at a local community center, hosting Saturday workshops for high school girls interested in STEM, because I remembered being 16, desperate for someone to tell me I was capable, and instead being told by Rick that my place was in the kitchen. My place was to lower my voice. My place was anywhere but in a room where ideas mattered. And seeing those girls walk in with uncertain expressions reminded me of who I used to be. Someone who knew she was meant for more, but did not yet have the words or guidance to reach it. And the first time one of them asked me how I became a software architect, I felt a warmth rise in me that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with healing, because the story I was telling them was no longer about survival. It was about possibility, the kind that grows when no one is standing on your neck. The peace I built in Golden continued to grow layer by layer. Small rituals, good mornings, soft evenings, a life untouched by the chaos that had once followed me. And then one afternoon, as I walked back from a workshop, a letter sat in my mailbox, tucked between a flyer and a utility bill, and the handwriting on the envelope made my breath catch because it was my mother's, her cursive, shaky, familiar, heavy, with everything she had never said aloud. I carried the letter inside, setting it gently on the table before opening it, my fingers lingering on the edge for a moment, as if I were preparing myself for something sharp. But when I finally unfolded the paper, the first line was not an excuse or an accusation. It was simply, "I am sorry," followed by a long, quiet explanation, written in uneven lines, where she admitted that she had spent years choosing the easiest path instead of the right one, that she had let Rick's voice become the loudest in the house because she thought keeping peace was the same as keeping family, that she never defended me because she did not know how to defend herself, and that watching everything crumble had shown her the truth. She refused to see Rick had been toxic, not just to me, but to her, slowly shaping her into someone she was ashamed to recognize. As I read the letter, my chest tightened, not with anger, but with something gentler, a cautious ache, because these were words I had never expected, and in the final paragraph she wrote, "I want a relationship with you, but I do not want you to feel like you have to rescue me ever again. Tell me what I need to do." And I sat there for a long moment, letting the honesty settle, before picking up a pen and writing my response, slowly, carefully, in the same calm tone I had learned to use with myself over the last months. I told her that I cared for her, that I always had, but that I would not rebuild anything on top of the old patterns that nearly destroyed both of us. And I wrote one sentence that felt like the turning point of my entire life. "If you want a relationship with me, choose yourself first. Not Rick, not comfort, not silence. Choose yourself." And I sealed the envelope, placing it back in the mailbox with a steadiness that surprised me, because sending boundaries used to feel like breaking something, but now it felt like planting something new. 2 weeks later, I received a call from her voice, quiet but steady. She said, "Mina." I left him, and for a moment I did not speak, not because I doubted her, but because I understood how much courage it took for someone who had spent 22 years living under a man who controlled every narrative to finally step out of the story he wrote for her. She said she packed her things one afternoon while he was out scrambling to fix his finances. She drove to Fort Collins, moved in with a friend from work and told him she was done with the shouting, the manipulation, the guilt, the excuses that always circled back to her being wrong, even when she was simply breathing. Hearing her say it felt like watching a door unlock a door I had been standing behind for years, waiting for her to find the strength to open it, and now that she had stepped through it, I felt something inside me soften a little more, because for the first time in my life, my mother was not choosing him. She was choosing herself, and that meant she was choosing the version of me who had survived long enough to show her what choosing yourself actually looked like. In the evenings after that call, I would sit on the porch with my coffee watching the slow swirl of snow around the cabin, thinking about how poetic justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it is a tow truck lifting a man's lies for the world to see. Sometimes it is a blocked message from someone who once laughed at you. Sometimes it is a mother finally walking away from the man who convinced her she deserved nothing better. And as the mountains faded into dusk and the breath of winter brushed against my face, I realized that healing was not the absence of pain. It was the presence of peace, the kind you build with your own hands after spending years letting others take from you, and sitting there surrounded by the life I created, I felt something settle in my chest, something steady, something whole, knowing that for the first time everything that broke me had finally led me back to myself. I drove before the sun rose because something about the early hours felt like a clean page, and the Pagani moved beneath me with a quiet hum that almost felt like breathing as I took the familiar winding road toward Lookout Mountain, letting the engine glide through the curves, while the cold air slipped in through the cracked window, touching my face with a sharpness that reminded me I was alive and free in a way I had fought years to earn. And as the sky shifted from deep blue to a pale silver, I felt the same slow brightening inside me, the one that started the moment I walked away from everything that tried to make me small. The road up the mountain was nearly empty at that hour, and the snow on the edges glittered under the rising light, while the city below still slept, and I kept climbing higher, feeling the weight of the past fall away the farther I went, until finally I reached the overlook, the place where the horizon stretched endlessly and the air was so thin and clean it felt like truth. And I parked the Pagani, letting the engine settle into silence as I stepped out onto the gravel, letting my boots crunch softly beneath me while the wind cut across the ridge sharp and cold and honest. I stood at the railing, fingers curled lightly around the metal, and watched as the first stream of daylight broke through the clouds, painting the world in a soft white glow, the kind of glow that made everything look new again. And in that fragile brightness, the memory of Rick's voice rose in my mind completely uninvited, as if carried on the wind the exact moment he pushed me back from his shiny car as if I were dirt, and said those words that once sank deep enough to bruise something inside me: "You do not belong." For a long second, I let the memory sit there, not to hurt me, but to remind me just how far I had come, because that sentence used to echo through my head every time I stepped into a room where people looked more confident or more put together, every time I doubted my own worth, every time I let old wounds decide how I should move. But standing there above the whole city, hearing nothing but the whisper of wind through the pines, I realized those words no longer had any place in me. I felt the cold sting on my cheeks, and I breathed out slowly, watching the vapor fade into the air, and that was when I smiled, not out of revenge, not out of triumph, but out of recognition, a quiet acceptance of the fact that everything Rick once tried to take from me had become the very thing that pushed me into the life he never believed I could build. And I whispered to the snow-lit horizon I did not need to belong in his car because I built an entire road of my own. That sentence settled into me like a final piece, finally clicking into place. And as I turned back toward the Pagani, the morning light hit the hood in a clean, bright reflection, almost blinding, but beautiful, a kind of brightness that felt right. because I had spent enough years in the shadows of someone else's insecurity, and now there was nothing left to shrink for. The city below was waking slowly, the faint hum of life rising from the valley, and I stood there a moment longer, letting the air wrap around me, letting the peace I fought for sink a little deeper. And I thought about the women who would one day hear this story, the women who spent years being told to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay grateful for crumbs, and I felt a soft warmth rise in my chest because I wanted them to know they were never meant to stay where someone else left them. When I finally opened the door of the Pagani and slid back into the seat, the leather cold, at first, then warming beneath my palms, I paused one last time before starting the engine and looked at my reflection in the small side mirror. The woman looking back at me, not the girl they underestimated, not the one they laughed at, not the one they used for her silence, but the one who survived it and built something stronger than their doubt. And I whispered softly, almost like a promise you belong where you choose to stand. The engine came to life with a clean, low growl, and as I eased back onto the mountain road, letting the tires grip the curve with quiet precision, I let the past fall completely behind me, knowing that the final act of justice was not Rick losing his car or his pride or his lies coming undone. The final act of justice was me driving forward untouched by the wreckage he created. The sun finally broke free from the clouds, entirely casting long, bright streaks across the road ahead, and with one hand resting lightly on the wheel, I let myself feel the full softness of that moment, knowing I had closed every door that needed closing and opened a road that was mine alone. And as the mountain stretched before me, endless and bright, I felt the kind of peace that settles only when you have walked through fire and come out carrying light. And if you are listening to this, if something in this story sits heavy or familiar in your chest, then tell me where you are watching from tonight, because maybe your road begins here too.